Lean in, assess, listen, and connect. So lean in and assess is probably the principle that is the most intuitive. It's the one that in our context is going to be reaching out to people, which we're doing, which you're doing. If you're getting this training, that you're already involved in reaching out to people. You're already involved in receiving phone calls. So you're already leaning in one sense. And therefore you're paying attention and observing for urgent needs. You're observing for people who lack safety. You're asking those questions, but essentially that is the core principles. You're asking questions when someone calls and you sense there's crisis. The first question is always, are you safe? Do you have the ability to be physically safe? And then, of course, what are the basic needs that beyond safety that you can begin to observe? And that's really just paying attention to what they say at this point, because we can't really see all of them. We can probably see their face and hear their voice. So that's therefore going to make the next principle the one that we need to talk about most, which is listening. And again, listening isn't just passively, it's actively listening. So, but it comes with these action steps. We're going to make contact. We're going to ask about spiritual and emotional needs as well as present concerns. Because people are going to have things that probably go beyond just their spiritual and emotional life. They're going to have economic issues. They're going to have food resource issues. And we want to listen and help people feel calm. Because throughout all of this, if someone is in crisis, their posture is going to be on one frequency, and we need to remain on another frequency, which is calm and supportive. So the first thing when we make contact, we're going to introduce ourselves, ask if they're in a safe, quiet place. That helps. If they can't, it's okay. We still have to maintain our ability to communicate with them. But here's an important one. So because we're working mostly on the phone and on the screen, we need to really communicate to somebody if there's a limited amount of time that we have. So you realize that the phone call is, okay, this is someone who's not well. They're edging on crisis. I need to kind of move into that crisis management interface mode. But maybe for whatever reason, you only have 30 minutes and you know that, and there's something that you just can't move. Then it helps up front to communicate that. Don't wait until you've got 2 minutes to go and the person is, in the peak of their emotional response. So give them a cue. It's okay. We're in a unique situation. We're not in front of people. You're not in a FEMA tent somewhere and seeing them face to face. You're on the phone and you're at your home and you're in the middle of, what's going on. Obviously, if you have 2 hours, you don't need to communicate. We have 2 hours. That's a generous amount of time. Communicate when there's limits, and it may, and you feel like this situation may exceed those limits. Also, try to communicate limited confidentiality. And what does that mean? Well, limited confidentiality means, hey, this conversation is confidential, but if you tell me you're going to harm yourself, or you might harm somebody else, or somebody in your care could be harmed, then that has to break confidentiality. You have to be able to say, hey, let's call in other people. Let's let other people into this conversation. That applies whether we're under normal circumstances in the prayer room or anywhere in Mariners Ministries. Is that everything's confidential, can be confidential, but there are limits to that, and that is always in the cases where someone may be harmed, including the person you're talking to. Okay, and guys, feel free to text any questions that you have if you feel like something isn't clear, or unmute your mic and let us know. Good? Okay. So as we think about listening, thanks, Brad. As we think about listening, we're going to ask about spiritual and emotional needs. Of course, this is obvious to us because this is what we're about. And we're going to talk about what are the present concerns they have. Although some things may be obvious, we don't want to make assumptions. And part of that is we don't want to be wrong, but also we want to engage someone in letting them tell us what they need. That's an empowering thing to do, is to say, hey, what do you need? Some people can be confused. They may not know. But asking them to step into naming their need is by no means diminishing to them. It actually affirms their dignity, affirms the fact that they can act, even though they may not know how to answer the question. So never shy away from asking someone what seems obvious, even if and I've had people say, well, isn't it obvious? It is. But what's not as obvious is the ability for me to communicate with you, for you to communicate to me about what you need. And so, of course, I don't say that, but that's the idea, is that there is an empowering, dignifying thing in asking someone to elicit their need. It could be challenging, but it's helpful. And so we're asking, when listening, what's most important to them. So we may assume that, hey, this person, they are telling me they need food, but really what's most important for them is they just want to know that they're going to be okay, or and so there's an emotional need there that's in front of what maybe seem like an obvious basic need. So pay attention to that, but use reflective listening when it's appropriate to better understand. Again, this helps our communication. It also helps slow the communication down. When you're in crisis, someone's talking, they're coming at you, they got needs, they're moving at a quick pace. But that actually, we want to slow that down and pay attention to how we communicate to them. Now, of course, if there's life-threatening things and their pace is because they feel like their life is threatened and that's real, then we want to speed up. But of course, we would be calling in resources for that. Okay, so this moves into helping people listen and feel calm. So as you're listening to someone, there will be a point at which, when you're listening, which means you're taking in the story, you're taking in the information, there'll be a point at which we need to offer comfort and we need to offer feedback, which means in this principle, we need to move to active listening, which is engaging in conversation. But the caveat there is as people unfold, there may be signs of acute grief, and there's a link there to a document that you can click on in your presentation that will take you to signs of acute grief to pay attention to, and even some suggestions on action steps, because we want to pay attention to people who are in the midst of grief as part of their crisis. But if they're distressed, help them slow down by your rate of speech. It's one of the easiest tools. As someone is it's also one of the hardest too, because crisis is contagious, and their emotional state will, even though we're not with them, will bleed into to our response, because we'll have an emotional response to their emotional response. That's how we work as human beings, and we'll have to regulate ourselves in order to help them regulate. But slowing down your speech is a huge, huge tool that can be employed. But we also now don't want to ignore emotions. But we don't want to. So we have to validate them, and we'll look at that in some of the suggestions on skills for modeling support. But we don't want to add to emotions. So if you can hear that someone is extremely anxious, extremely excited, we don't want to ask them, well, could you unpack that anxiety for me? Or let's move deeper into that sadness. At this point, we're trying to acknowledge and validate the way they feel, but not really pull it apart and add to it, because it's already enough, right? It's already potentially overwhelming for them. So we want to think about that as we listen and help people feel calm. Okay, we're going to go through a few skills. These are suggestions. Now you'll have these. So this PowerPoint deck is meant not just to be a presentation, but also kind of a manual. So there's a lot of information in here that you can refer to as you think about listening skills and how to handle these. But we'll pull from these as we look at our case studies that we're going to look at. But essentially here's modeling supportive responses that you can see here. Here are reflective responses. So part of reflective listening comes by slowing things down and say, hey, it sounds like you're saying, and then you summarize or rephrase or reframe what they've said, not reframe, but you would summarize it to help them know that, hey, you're paying attention, you hear them, you see them. And again, these are intuitive things you probably already do in your normal life. These are things we need to remember. Clarifying comments, they need to be handled with care, because they're reflective listening skills, but we got to pay attention to our tone so it doesn't come off as accusatory or like you're putting them on the stand. So that we can go with, meet them where they are and let these comments that are clarifying, which sometimes you just have to have them sometimes because you're not understanding them, they're not making sense. But if they're not making sense, you definitely want to ask clarifying questions, but do it in a tone that is supportive. Empowering responses. These are vital, but they must be done later in the conversation. So you don't want to start with empowering responses because it may be too much for someone to handle when they haven't felt heard or seen yet. Because when we do empower people and encourage them, this is kind of a coaching thing, which means we need to have brought them along and let them feel safe and calm before we challenge them. And so empowering responses can come off as challenges, which is okay because they are. So are there any things that you would like help with to make you feel better, or that would help you feel better? Okay, well, now that's a challenge to someone's in crisis because they have to think, okay, what are the things that help me feel better? Or I have to use my imagination. I have to almost in one sense become curious, which is really hard to do when you're afraid. So empowering responses come later in the conversation when you feel like, okay, this person's now at a lower level than when they started. I can then enter into, what would it look like for you to take a next step, that kind of thing. The assumption being that they can.